Now, it's lovely for us to stand around here all night and talk about it. But the truth is, you only learn to ride a bicycle by riding a bicycle. You only learn to play baseball by playing baseball. You only learn to cook by cooking. You could read every book there was to read about baseball, but it wouldn't make you a great baseball player. And so it is with prayer. The only way to learn to pray is to pray, is to get comfortable in that silence, is to get comfortable in that silence. But the truth is, we're not comfortable in the silence. We're not comfortable in the silence. If I stop speaking here, after about 10 seconds, people would start to cough. After about 10 seconds, people would start to cough. If I stop speaking here, we're not comfortable in the silence. I saw in USA Today 3 or 4 years ago now, you know, they had that little section down on the bottom left-hand corner. You know, they do these little surveys. You know, I saw this survey. The 10 things that Americans were most uncomfortable with or most afraid of. Number 1, death and dying. Number 2, flying. Number 3, public speaking. Number 4, spiders and snakes, I think. Number 5, silence. Silence. We're afraid of silence. We're uncomfortable in the silence. Why? Let's try it this way. Is everyone familiar with Da Vinci's portrait of the Last Supper? Yes or yes? Yeah. It's the one where all the people are on one side of the table, you know? I don't know about you, but I always thought that was a little bit strange, you know? I don't know what happens at your house, but at my house we don't do it like that, you know? I don't know what Da Vinci thought Jesus might have said that night, you know? Maybe Da Vinci, you know, in meditating upon the scene, thought that Jesus said something like, all right, guys, on this side of the table, we're going to take the photo now. When Da Vinci decided to paint this portrait of the Last Supper, he decided that he wanted to find 13 men that looked like what he thought Jesus and the disciples would have looked like. So he began walking through the streets of Milan. He was living in Milan at the time. He began walking through the streets of Milan, searching the faces of men, looking for men that looked like what he thought Jesus and the disciples would have looked like. And one Sunday he was at church and he looked up into the choir loft and he saw a young man that looked like what he thought Jesus would have looked like. He approached the young man and explained to him what he was doing and asked him, would he agree to pose while Da Vinci made some sketches for his painting. The young man agreed, and he came to Da Vinci's studio for 3-4 days while Da Vinci set about beginning his famous portrait of the Last Supper. And when Da Vinci was finished painting the picture of Jesus, he began his search for each of the disciples, walking through the streets of Milan each day for hours at a time. And in 7 months, he found and painted all of the 12 disciples except one, Judas. He found a Peter and a John and a Matthew, but he couldn't find a man that looked like what he thought Judas would have looked like. He began walking through the streets of Milan 8-10 hours a day, obsessing, searching for a man that looked like what he thought Judas would have looked like, but nothing. And finally, he set the artwork aside and began to work on other pieces. This portrait of the Last Supper remained unfinished for 11 years. Finally, Da Vinci decided that he had been searching in all of the wrong places. That if he was to find a man that looked like what he thought Judas would have looked like, he would have to search in places where men like that congregate. And at the time, there were 4 prisons on the outskirts of Milan, and so Da Vinci resolved to visit each of the 4 prisons. And in the third prison, he found a man that looked like what he thought Judas would have looked like. He explained to the prisoner what he was doing, and he asked the prisoner, would he agree to pose for this painting? The prisoner agreed, and he was brought under guard from the prison into Milan to Da Vinci's studio. And there he posed for Da Vinci for 4 days as Da Vinci set about finishing his famous portrait of the Last Supper. About halfway through the 4th day, Da Vinci noticed that over the days, the prisoner would look at the painting and then at Da Vinci and then down at the ground, and that every time he did this, a great sadness came upon him. And finally, Da Vinci became so disturbed by what he was witnessing in the prisoner that he stopped painting and he said to the prisoner, "Is something wrong? Am I doing something to upset you?" The prisoner, he put his head down in his hands and he began to weep inconsolably. When he finished crying, he looked up at Da Vinci and he said, "Master, don't you recognize me?" Da Vinci said, "I'm sorry, I don't. Were you one of my students?" The prisoner said, "No, but 11 years ago, I posed for you in this same painting as the person of Jesus." And that's why we avoid silence. That's why we avoid silence. Because in each of us, there is a Judas and a Jesus. In each of us, there is a lesser version of ourselves and a better version of ourselves. And when we come into the silence, we become intimately aware of these two realities at one time. Whenever we step into the silence, we become aware of who we are, strengths and weaknesses, faults, failings, flaws, defects, talents, abilities, potential. But we also become aware of who we are capable of becoming. We become aware of this vision of the best version of ourselves. And in seeing those two things at one time, we're automatically challenged to change, to grow, to develop, to become the best version of ourselves. And that's why we avoid silence, because of that challenge to change, to grow, because of that invitation to transformation. That's why we avoid the silence. That's why we fill our lives with noise. I mean, let's face it, we wake up to clock radios, we listen to radio while we shower, we watch television while we eat breakfast, we listen to radio in the car on the way to work, we listen to radio all day over the intercom. We make phone calls, we get put on hold, we listen to the radio. We got Walkmans and Discmans and cell phones and pages and CDs and DVDs and TVs and internet. We got so much noise we can't even hear our own thoughts. We can't even hear our own. What is the first thing you do when you get in the car? Turn on the radio? No. Why? Because the radio's already on. We've filled our lives with noise. We've filled our lives with noise because silence issues the eternal challenge to become the best version of ourselves. Silence issues the eternal challenge to become all we can be. We fill our lives with noise to avoid that challenge. We fill our lives with noise to avoid that challenge to change, to grow. And in rejecting that challenge to change and to grow, we reject happiness. We reject our chance at happiness. Because as we discussed last night, this journey is life. Physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, when we're making this journey from point A to point B, when we're changing, when we're growing, when we're developing, when we're becoming the best version of ourselves in each of these 4 areas of life, we feel more fully alive, we're healthier, we're happier, we have a richer, more abundant experience of life. If it doesn't exist between point A and point B, at very best, it's a waste of time, a waste of life. And so God's invitation, ever since the beginning of time, a call to prayer. For His sake? No. To help him? No. To make him happy? No, he's already happy, perfectly contented. God doesn't call us to prayer to help him. He calls us to prayer to help us. He doesn't call us to prayer to make him happy. He calls us to prayer to allow us to share in the happiness that is life, lived passionately, energetically, enthusiastically. Prayer. Prayer. People ask me, do you pray? People ask me, why do you pray? Thoreau once wrote, I went to the woods because I wanted to live life deliberately. I went to the woods because I wanted to live deeply, to suck out all the marrow of life. I went to the woods to put to rout all the things that are not life, because I did not want to come to die and discover that I had not lived. Prayer. Yeah, I pray. Why? Because I can't live without it. I don't know how you survive out there in that crazy, noisy, busy world without that time in silence each day to get a sense of who you are and where you're going. Without that time in silence each day to get reconnected with self, reconnected with God. Prayer? Yeah, I pray. Why? I come to the woods of prayer because I want to live life deliberately. I look around me and most people's lives, they're just a reaction. The doorbell rings, they react. The phone rings, they react. The cell phone rings, they react. The pager rings, they react. Their boss yells at them, they react. Just a series of reactions. I don't want my life to be a reaction. I want my life to be an action. I come to the woods of prayer because I want to live life deliberately. I come to the woods of prayer because I want to live life deeply. I want to suck out all the marrow of life. I come to the woods of prayer to work out what is worthy of life and what is a waste of life. I come to the woods of prayer to put to rout all the things that are not life. I come to the woods of prayer. I come to the woods of prayer because I don't want to come to die and discover that I haven't lived.